March 27, 1945, brought an ominous rumble across the darkened waters of Tokyo Bay as Captain Hiroshi Yamamoto peered through his submarine's periscope at what appeared to be another routine American bombing mission. The massive Boeing B-29 superfortresses flew in perfect formation overhead, their silver wings catching the moonlight like deadly angels of war. What Captain Yamamoto could not have known was that these aircraft carried no incendiary bombs destined for Japanese cities. Instead, their bellies held something far more sinister and strategically devastating. The operation unfolding above him represented one of the most secretive and effective campaigns of the Pacific War, codenamed Operation Starvation. Unlike the thunderous bombing raids that had become tragically familiar to Japanese civilians, this mission proceeded in complete silence from the enemy's perspective. The B-29 crews flying at 15,000 feet were methodically dropping magnetic and acoustic mines into the shipping lanes that served as Japan's maritime lifelines. Commander Robert McNamara, who would later become Secretary of Defense, had conceived this strategy as part of the 21st Bomber Command's comprehensive assault on Japan's ability to sustain its war effort. The brilliance of Operation Starvation lay not in its immediate destructive power, but in its invisible persistence. Each mine that splashed silently into the dark waters below would remain dormant, waiting patiently for the distinctive magnetic signature or acoustic pattern of an approaching Japanese vessel. The Japanese Imperial Navy had become increasingly desperate by early 1945, with their conventional fleet decimated by years of intense Pacific warfare. Merchant shipping had become absolutely critical for moving essential supplies between the home islands and maintaining communication with remaining overseas territories. The narrow straits and shallow coastal waters around Japan, which had once provided natural protection, would now become deadly traps lined with American mines. What made this campaign particularly devastating was the Japanese military leadership's complete ignorance of its existence. Unlike bombing raids that left visible destruction and generated immediate intelligence reports, the mining operation remained essentially invisible. Japanese ships simply began disappearing with increasing frequency, often without distress signals or survivors to explain what had happened. The mysterious sinkings created a climate of fear and confusion among Japanese naval commanders who struggled to understand why their vessels were being destroyed in supposedly safe waters. Intelligence reports from the Japanese Naval General Staff during this period, later discovered in post-war archives, reveal the growing alarm among senior officers who could not explain the mounting shipping losses. Admiral Soemu Toyota, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, repeatedly demanded explanations from regional commanders who had no answers to provide. The psychological impact of these unexplained disasters began undermining morale throughout the Japanese maritime forces. The B-29 crews executing Operation Starvation flew their missions with clinical precision, following carefully planned routes that would maximize the strategic placement of mines while minimizing exposure to Japanese anti-aircraft defenses. Each aircraft carried approximately 12 mines, and the cumulative effect of multiple sorties would ultimately place over 12,000 of these deadly devices in Japanese waters. The crews understood they were participating in something historically significant, even if the full scope of their mission's success would not become apparent until after the war's conclusion. As Captain Yamamoto's submarine slipped beneath the surface of Tokyo Bay that March evening, the silent seeds of Japan's maritime destruction had already been planted in the waters above him, waiting patiently to claim their first victims. April 15, 1945, marked the beginning of Japan's maritime nightmare. Though Admiral Kichisaburo Nomura could not have comprehended the systematic nature of the disaster unfolding before his eyes. Standing in the operations room of the Japanese Naval General Staff Headquarters, he studied the growing collection of red pins on the strategic map, each representing another merchant vessel that had simply vanished without explanation. The first major victim of Operation Starvation had been the cargo ship Awa Maru, a vessel desperately needed to transport rice and medical supplies between the home islands. The ship's captain, Tetsuo Nishimura, had followed all prescribed safety protocols when departing Shimonoseki Harbor on the morning of April 12th. His vessel carried critical supplies for civilian populations facing increasing food shortages, making its safe passage essential for maintaining public morale. According to declassified documents from the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey published in 1946, the magnetic mine that destroyed Awa Maru had been precisely positioned in the shipping channel 3 weeks earlier by a B-29 from the 313th Bombardment Wing. The mine's sophisticated triggering mechanism had detected the ship's magnetic signature as it passed overhead, detonating with devastating efficiency that left no survivors to report the cause of the explosion. What terrified Japanese naval commanders was the apparent randomness of these incidents. Ships following identical routes on consecutive days might experience completely different fates, one passing safely, while another disappeared entirely. This unpredictability created a psychological warfare effect that American strategists had not fully anticipated but quickly recognized as strategically valuable. The Japanese merchant marine, already weakened by years of submarine warfare and air attacks, began showing signs of severe strain under this mysterious new threat. Captains started requesting additional escort vessels for routine cargo runs, but the Imperial Navy possessed insufficient resources to provide adequate protection for the volume of shipping required to sustain the war effort. The invisible menace lurking beneath the waves forced difficult decisions about which cargo shipments deserved priority protection. Intelligence analyst Lieutenant Colonel Saburo Hayashi spent countless hours attempting to identify patterns in the shipping losses that might reveal the nature of the threat. His reports to the Naval General Staff, preserved in post-war archives, demonstrate the frustration felt by Japanese military leaders who could not comprehend why their vessels were being destroyed in areas previously considered safe from American attack. The mining campaign's effectiveness exceeded even the most optimistic projections of American military planners. General Curtis LeMay, commanding the 21st Bomber Command, had initially estimated that the mines would disrupt Japanese shipping for several months. However, the psychological impact of the unexplained sinkings proved far more devastating than the physical destruction alone, creating a climate of fear that paralyzed maritime operations throughout the Japanese home islands. By late April, insurance rates for Japanese merchant shipping had become prohibitively expensive, effectively ending commercial maritime transport in many coastal regions. The Zaibatsu industrial conglomerates that controlled much of Japan's economy began hoarding critical materials rather than risk their loss during transport, further disrupting the already strained wartime economy. The cumulative effect of Operation Starvation was gradually strangling Japan's ability to function as a modern industrial nation. Each successful mine detonation not only destroyed a valuable vessel and its cargo, but also created ripple effects throughout the Japanese economic and military systems that would ultimately prove more damaging than any conventional bombing campaign. May 8, 1945 witnessed one of the most devastating single incidents of Operation Starvation when the hospital ship Takasago Maru struck an acoustic mine in the Kanman Strait, creating a humanitarian disaster that Japanese officials desperately attempted to conceal from their own population. Dr. Kenji Matsumoto, the ship's chief medical officer, had been treating wounded soldiers being evacuated from overseas territories when the massive explosion tore through the vessel's hull. The destruction of clearly marked hospital ships violated international maritime law, but the American mines made no distinction between military and civilian vessels. They responded only to the physical characteristics of passing ships. This indiscriminate nature of the mining campaign created profound moral dilemmas for both sides of the conflict, though these ethical considerations remained largely hidden from public view during the war. Captain James Doolittle, commanding the 8th Air Force's contribution to Operation Starvation, maintained detailed records of mine placement that would later provide crucial evidence for post-war casualty assessments. His logbooks, discovered in military archives during the 1970s, revealed the methodical precision with which American forces had targeted Japan's most critical shipping routes. The Japanese government's response to the mounting maritime disasters demonstrated the regime's increasing desperation and declining administrative capabilities. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki issued secret directives requiring all shipping incidents to be reported directly to his office, bypassing normal military channels. These reports painted a devastating picture of Japan's maritime collapse that Suzuki shared only with Emperor Hirohito and the most senior government officials. Maritime insurance companies, both domestic and neutral foreign firms, began refusing coverage for any vessels operating in Japanese waters. the Nippon Yusen shipping line, one of Japan's largest maritime operators, secretly approached Swiss intermediaries about negotiating safe passage agreements with American forces, a clear indication that Japanese business leaders had recognized their nation's increasingly hopeless military situation. The psychological warfare aspects of Operation Starvation extended beyond the immediate shipping losses to affect civilian morale throughout Japan. Families in coastal communities who depended on maritime commerce for their livelihoods found themselves increasingly isolated, as ship captains refused to risk their vessels in what had become known as the Devil's Waters. The mysterious nature of the shipping disasters spawned numerous rumors and superstitions among the Japanese population. Intelligence reports from neutral diplomats stationed in Japan during this period, later published in the State Department's Foreign Relations series, described a nation gradually choking on its own isolation. The Swedish ambassador to Tokyo, Widar Bage, reported to Stockholm that Japanese officials seemed increasingly bewildered by their inability to maintain basic maritime communications between their own territories. The cumulative tonnage of shipping destroyed by American mines during May 1945 exceeded the losses inflicted by submarine warfare during the same period. This represented a significant shift in the balance of anti-shipping warfare, though American military leaders remained cautious about publicizing the mining campaign's success due to concerns about revealing operational details that might help Japanese forces develop countermeasures. Local fishing communities along Japan's coastline began reporting strange underwater explosions that killed fish and damaged their nets. These incidents, documented in prefectural government records, provided the first concrete evidence available to Japanese civilians that some form of underwater warfare was being conducted in their coastal waters, though the full scope of Operation Starvation remained hidden from public knowledge. The strategic brilliance of the mining campaign lay in its ability to create maximum disruption with minimal resources, forcing Japanese forces to divert precious personnel and equipment from other military priorities to address a threat they could not fully comprehend or effectively counter. June 23, 1945, brought Emperor Hirohito face-to-face with the devastating reality of Japan's maritime collapse during a private briefing that would ultimately influence his decision to surrender. Navy Minister Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai presented classified casualty reports showing that Japanese shipping losses had reached catastrophic levels, with entire coastal regions now effectively cut off from essential supplies due to the mysterious underwater explosions. The imperial palace had become increasingly isolated as the mining campaign severed communications between Tokyo and Japan's remaining overseas territories. Prince Fumimaro Konoe, serving as one of the emperor's closest advisors, privately expressed concerns that Japan's ability to conduct organized resistance was rapidly deteriorating due to the collapse of maritime logistics networks. Within the walls of the Naval General Staff headquarters, intelligence officers worked frantically to understand the nature of the threat destroying their shipping. Commander Minoru Genda, one of Japan's most brilliant naval strategists and architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, led a special investigation team tasked with analyzing the pattern of ship losses. His confidential report to Admiral Toyota, discovered in post-war Japanese archives, revealed the growing realization that Japan faced a form of warfare unlike anything previously encountered. The B-29 missions continued with methodical precision throughout June, adding hundreds of additional mines to the deadly network already choking Japan's maritime routes. Colonel Paul Tibbets, who would later pilot the aircraft that dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, participated in several mining missions during this period, later describing them as the most strategically important flights of the war that nobody talks about. Japanese attempts to clear the mines proved largely futile due to the sophisticated technology employed in American mining operations. The mines' magnetic and acoustic triggering systems made them nearly impossible to detect using available Japanese equipment. Minesweeping operations often resulted in additional casualties as the clearing vessels themselves fell victim to the very weapons they sought to eliminate. Food shortages in major Japanese cities began reaching critical levels as the mining campaign prevented delivery of rice and other essential commodities from agricultural regions. The Japanese government implemented increasingly severe rationing measures, but these administrative responses could not address the fundamental problem of transportation paralysis created by Operation Starvation. Secret peace negotiations conducted through Soviet and Swedish intermediaries during this period reflected Japan's growing desperation to end the conflict before complete economic collapse became inevitable. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo's diplomatic cables, decoded by American intelligence services, revealed Japanese willingness to consider surrender terms that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war. The mining campaign's impact extended beyond physical destruction to create a crisis of confidence within Japan's military leadership. Senior officers, who had once projected unwavering determination, began privately questioning whether continued resistance served any meaningful purpose, given the nation's inability to maintain basic logistical operations. American military planners recognized that Operation Starvation had achieved its primary objective of severing Japan's maritime supply lines, but they continued expanding the mining operations to ensure complete strategic dominance. The success of the campaign provided compelling evidence for post-war military theorists arguing that economic warfare could be more decisive than conventional military action. Local government officials in coastal prefectures began reporting increasing incidents of civil unrest as communities faced starvation due to their inability to receive food shipments. These reports, carefully suppressed by Japanese censors during the war, painted a picture of a nation rapidly approaching complete societal breakdown due to the invisible warfare being conducted in its surrounding waters. July 19, 1945, marked a turning point in Japanese understanding of their maritime crisis, when Naval Engineer Lieutenant Commander Yoshio Kodama successfully recovered fragments from a mine explosion that had destroyed the freighter Hokkaido Maru near Osaka Bay. His technical analysis, preserved in Japanese naval archives, provided the first concrete evidence that American forces were conducting a sophisticated mining campaign, rather than the submarine warfare that Japanese commanders had initially suspected. The recovered mine components revealed the advanced nature of American naval technology, incorporating magnetic sensors and acoustic triggers far beyond anything in Japanese arsenals. Kodama's report to the technical department of the Naval General Staff described weapon systems that could remain dormant for months while waiting for specific target signatures, representing a level of technological sophistication that highlighted Japan's industrial disadvantages. Rear Admiral Takejiro Onishi, architect of the Kamikaze program, reviewed Kodama's findings with growing alarm. The mining campaign represented exactly the type of systematic, technology-driven warfare that Japan was least equipped to counter. Unlike the personal courage and sacrifice that characterized Japanese military tradition, defeating the American mines required industrial capacity and technical expertise that Japan simply did not possess. The B-29 crews of the 504th Bombardment Group continued their nocturnal mining missions with increasing efficiency throughout July. Flight records maintained by the group's operations officer, Major Thomas Farabee, documented the precise placement of mines in shipping channels that intelligence analysts had identified as critical to Japanese logistics networks. Japanese merchant marine casualties during July exceeded all previous monthly totals, as the cumulative effect of thousands of mines began claiming victims with devastating regularity. The steamship Yamato Maru, carrying desperately needed medical supplies for military hospitals, struck a mine while attempting to reach Nagoya Harbor. The explosion killed all 73 crew members and destroyed antibiotics that could have saved hundreds of wounded Japanese soldiers. Prime Minister Suzuki's private correspondence with Emperor Hirohito during this period, discovered in imperial household archives after the war, revealed the government's growing recognition that Japan could not survive much longer without functional maritime communications. The Prime Minister's letters described a nation gradually suffocating under the weight of its own isolation. The mining campaign had effectively transformed Japan's coastal waters into what American naval strategists termed an enormous minefield that made normal commerce impossible. Fishing fleets that had provided protein for civilian populations found themselves unable to operate safely, contributing to the malnutrition that was becoming endemic throughout Japanese society. Intelligence reports from the Office of Strategic Services, declassified in the 1970s, documented the psychological impact of Operation Starvation on Japanese morale. OSS agents operating in neutral countries reported that Japanese diplomats were privately expressing despair about their nation's ability to continue organized resistance given the collapse of maritime logistics. The sophisticated nature of American mines made countermeasures nearly impossible with available Japanese technology. Attempts to develop magnetic degaussing equipment for merchant ships proved largely unsuccessful, while acoustic signature modification required industrial resources that Japan could not spare from weapons production. Local newspapers in Japan began reporting increasing numbers of maritime accidents, without providing details that might reveal the systematic nature of the mining campaign. These censored reports created public awareness that something catastrophic was happening to Japanese shipping while concealing the true extent of the disaster from civilian populations. The cumulative tonnage of Japanese shipping destroyed by mines during July 1945 represented approximately 30% of the nation's remaining merchant fleet, a loss rate that made continued maritime operations economically unsustainable, regardless of military considerations. August 7, 1945 found Captain Saburo Sakai desperately attempting to navigate his cargo vessel through the mine-infested waters of the inland sea while carrying the last shipment of strategic materials from Japan's dwindling stockpiles. The veteran mariner had survived 3 previous mine encounters through a combination of skill and extraordinary luck, but he understood that each voyage might be his final one as the invisible American weapons continued claiming victims with merciless efficiency. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima on August 6th had dominated Japanese attention, but the ongoing maritime paralysis created by Operation Starvation remained equally devastating to the nation's ability to function. Emperor Hirohito's decision to surrender would be influenced by multiple factors, including the recognition that Japan could not sustain organized resistance without functional supply lines between its territories. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz's final assessment of Operation Starvation, submitted to the Joint Chiefs of Staff on August 10th, credited the mining campaign with destroying 670 Japanese vessels and effectively ending Japan's capacity for maritime commerce. His report emphasized that the mines had achieved strategic objectives that would have required months of conventional bombing or massive naval battles to accomplish. Within the Japanese government, the realization that American mines had created an impenetrable barrier around their nation contributed to the growing consensus that continued resistance was futile. Foreign Minister Togo's communications with Japanese ambassadors in neutral countries revealed acknowledgement that Japan had been effectively isolated from the outside world by the combination of naval blockade and systematic mining operations. The technical superiority demonstrated by American mining technology provided sobering evidence of the industrial and scientific advantages that made Japanese victory impossible. Naval engineer Kodama's final report to his superiors described weapon systems that represented a glimpse into the future of warfare, that Japan was completely unprepared to counter with existing resources. Japanese attempts to maintain communication with remaining overseas territories had been reduced to occasional submarine missions and long-range aircraft flights, both extremely hazardous operations with high casualty rates. The mining of major harbors and shipping channels had essentially severed Japan's connections with territories that still contained significant military forces and civilian populations. The human cost of Operation Starvation extended far beyond military casualties to include thousands of Japanese civilians who died from starvation, disease, and exposure due to the collapse of maritime supply networks. Hospitals in major cities reported increasing numbers of malnutrition cases as food distribution systems failed due to transportation paralysis. American military planners recognized that the mining campaign had achieved its strategic objectives more completely than any other single operation of the Pacific War. The relatively small investment in aircraft sorties and mine production had generated strategic effects comparable to major naval battles while avoiding the massive casualties associated with conventional military operations. The psychological impact of the mysterious mine warfare contributed to the sense of helplessness that pervaded Japanese military and civilian leadership during the final weeks of the war. The inability to understand or counter the American mining operations created a crisis of confidence that undermined support for continued resistance among previously determined military leaders. Secret police reports from Japanese prefectural governments during early August described increasing incidents of defeatist sentiment among civilian populations who could observe the evidence of maritime collapse in their daily lives. The combination of food shortages, communication failures, and mysterious shipping disasters created a climate of despair that made Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement more acceptable to the Japanese people. August 14, 1945, brought the final tally of Operation Starvation's devastating success, as Admiral William Halsey's staff compiled comprehensive reports on the mining campaign's strategic achievements. The 12,000 mines dropped by B-29 aircraft had created an underwater graveyard containing the remains of 670 Japanese vessels, representing one of the most cost-effective military operations in modern warfare history. The Japanese government's decision to surrender on August 15th came after Emperor Hirohito received final briefings on the nation's complete maritime collapse. Navy Minister Yonai's presentation to the Imperial War Council included classified statistics showing that Japanese shipping capacity had been reduced to less than 10% of pre-war levels, making continued resistance logistically impossible, regardless of military determination. Post-war interrogations of Japanese military leaders revealed the profound impact that Operation Starvation had exerted on strategic decision-making during the final months of the Pacific War. General Korichika Anami, war minister during the surrender negotiations, later admitted that the mining campaign had been more devastating to Japanese morale than any bombing raid, because of its invisible and apparently unstoppable nature. The technical sophistication of American mines continued to impress Japanese naval experts even after the war's conclusion. Commander Kodama's post-surrender analysis, prepared for Allied occupation authorities, described the mining operation as a masterpiece of naval warfare that had employed cutting-edge technology to achieve maximum strategic impact with minimal resources. American casualties from Operation Starvation totaled fewer than 100 aircrew members, mostly from aircraft accidents and mechanical failures, rather than enemy action. This represented an extraordinarily favorable casualty exchange ratio compared to conventional military operations, highlighting the strategic value of technological warfare over direct confrontation. The economic impact of the mining campaign extended far beyond immediate shipping losses to create long-term damage to Japan's industrial capacity. Factories that depended on maritime transportation for raw materials had been forced to cease operations, while agricultural regions cut off from urban markets experienced widespread crop spoilage due to transportation paralysis. Intelligence assessments prepared by the Strategic Bombing Survey team that arrived in Japan after the surrender confirmed that Operation Starvation had been more strategically decisive than the atomic bombings in terms of its cumulative impact on Japanese war-making capability. The mining campaign had systematically dismantled Japan's ability to function as a modern industrial nation over a period of several months. The human tragedy of Operation Starvation included thousands of Japanese civilians who perished due to the collapse of maritime supply networks. Medical facilities reported increasing numbers of deaths from malnutrition and preventable diseases as the transportation of food and medicine became impossible due to mine warfare. Local fishing communities throughout Japan discovered the true extent of the mining operations only after American mine-sweeping teams began clearing the weapons following Japan's surrender. The systematic nature of mine placement revealed the careful planning and intelligence analysis that had made Operation Starvation so devastatingly effective. The psychological warfare aspects of the mining campaign continued to influence Japanese strategic thinking even after the war's conclusion. Military leaders who had experienced the helplessness of fighting an invisible enemy they could neither locate nor counter developed profound respect for technological warfare that would influence Japanese defense planning throughout the post-war period. American naval strategists studying the results of Operation Starvation concluded that mining operations represented one of the most effective methods of economic warfare ever developed, capable of achieving strategic objectives that would require massive conventional forces to accomplish through direct military action. September 2, 1945, marked Japan's formal surrender aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, with the waters below containing thousands of American mines that had played a crucial but largely unrecognized role in ending the Pacific War. General Douglas MacArthur's acceptance of Japanese surrender occurred in the same maritime region where B-29 aircraft had systematically placed the underwater weapons that strangled Japan's ability to sustain organized resistance. The comprehensive scope of Operation Starvation became apparent only after American minesweeping teams began the dangerous task of clearing the weapons from Japanese waters. Mine disposal expert Commander George Bauernschmidt led teams that would spend over 2 years locating and destroying the 12,000 mines that had been strategically positioned throughout Japan's coastal regions during the final months of the war. Japanese officials cooperating with Allied occupation forces provided detailed testimonies about the mining campaign's impact on their nation's final strategic decisions. Admiral Toyoda's post-surrender interview with American intelligence officers revealed that Japanese naval leadership had recognized the impossibility of maintaining maritime communications months before the atomic bombings occurred. The statistical analysis of Operation Starvation's effectiveness, compiled by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey in 1946, documented the destruction of 670 Japanese vessels, totaling over 1.2 million tons of shipping. This represented approximately 60% of Japan's remaining merchant marine capacity and included vessels essential for transporting food, medical supplies, and military equipment between the home islands. American military historians studying the Pacific War's conclusion would later identify Operation Starvation as one of the most strategically decisive campaigns that received minimal public attention during or after the conflict. The mining operations had effectively ended Japan's ability to function as a maritime nation while generating virtually no publicity compared to conventional bombing campaigns or naval battles. The technological achievements demonstrated by American mining operations provided compelling evidence of United States industrial and scientific superiority that influenced post-war geopolitical relationships. The sophisticated sensors and triggering mechanisms incorporated into the mines represented cutting-edge military technology that established American naval dominance for decades following the war's conclusion. Local Japanese communities affected by the mining campaign began sharing their experiences only after Allied occupation authorities encouraged honest reporting about wartime conditions. Fishermen from coastal villages described the terror of watching vessels disappear without warning in waters they had considered safe, creating psychological trauma that persisted long after the mines were cleared. The economic reconstruction of Japan required extensive American assistance to restore maritime commerce capabilities that had been systematically destroyed by Operation Starvation. The irony that former enemies collaborated to rebuild shipping networks previously targeted by American forces demonstrated the complex transition from warfare to peaceful cooperation that characterized the post-war Pacific region. Intelligence documents declassified decades after the war revealed the meticulous planning that had made Operation Starvation possible. American analysts had studied Japanese shipping patterns, harbor configurations, and maritime geography with extraordinary precision to maximize the strategic impact of each mine placement. The legacy of Operation Starvation influenced naval warfare doctrine throughout the Cold War period, as military strategists recognized the potential for relatively inexpensive mining operations to achieve strategic objectives traditionally requiring massive conventional forces. The campaign demonstrated that technological superiority could multiply the effectiveness of limited resources when applied with careful intelligence analysis and strategic planning. December 7, 1945 brought the 4th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, as American minesweeping operations in Japanese waters continued the painstaking process of removing the underwater weapons that had sealed Japan's maritime fate. The irony that American forces were now working to restore Japanese shipping capabilities they had systematically destroyed highlighted the complex transformation from total warfare to occupation and reconstruction that characterized the Pacific Theater's transition to peace. The complete scope of Operation Starvation's strategic impact became clear through comprehensive post-war analyses conducted by both American and Japanese military historians. The mining campaign had not only destroyed 670 vessels, but had also created psychological effects that undermined Japanese willingness to continue fighting even before the atomic bombs demonstrated American technological supremacy in the most dramatic possible manner. Emperor Hirohito's private reflections on Japan's surrender decision, recorded in his personal diary and later made available to historians, acknowledged that the collapse of maritime communications had convinced him that continued resistance would result in the complete destruction of Japanese civilization. The systematic nature of American mining operations had demonstrated that Japan faced an enemy capable of methodically dismantling every aspect of modern life. The human cost of Operation Starvation extended far beyond military casualties to encompass thousands of Japanese civilians who died from starvation, disease, and exposure caused by the transportation paralysis created by mine warfare. Medical facilities throughout Japan reported unprecedented mortality rates during the final months of the war, as essential supplies became impossible to transport between the home islands. American military leaders studying the results of Operation Starvation concluded that the mining campaign represented one of the most cost-effective strategic operations in military history. The relatively small investment in aircraft sorties and mine production had generated strategic effects comparable to major naval battles, while avoiding the massive casualties associated with conventional amphibious operations against the Japanese home islands. The technological sophistication demonstrated by American mines provided Japanese engineers with their first concrete evidence of the industrial and scientific advantages that made continued resistance futile. Post-war examination of recovered mine components revealed weapon systems incorporating magnetic sensors, acoustic triggers, and timing mechanisms far beyond anything in Japanese arsenals. Local fishing communities throughout Japan discovered the true extent of the mining operations only as American mine-sweeping teams systematically cleared the weapons following surrender. The careful placement of mines in shipping channels, harbor approaches, and coastal fishing grounds revealed the intelligence analysis and strategic planning that had made Operation Starvation devastatingly effective. The psychological impact of fighting an invisible enemy they could neither locate nor counter had profound effects on Japanese military morale during the war's final months. Senior naval officers who had once projected confidence in ultimate victory found themselves unable to explain or prevent the systematic destruction of their nation's maritime capabilities. Intelligence documents declassified in the 1970s revealed that Operation Starvation had achieved strategic objectives that American planners had not fully anticipated. The mining campaign's success in creating transportation paralysis had effects throughout Japanese society that extended far beyond the immediate destruction of shipping vessels. The legacy of Operation Starvation continues to influence naval warfare doctrine and strategic planning in the modern era. Military analysts studying asymmetric warfare recognize the campaign as a demonstration of how technological superiority and careful intelligence analysis can achieve decisive strategic results with relatively modest resource investments, providing lessons applicable to contemporary conflicts where conventional military approaches prove ineffective or prohibitively expensive. The silent victory achieved by 12,000 American mines in Japanese waters stands as testimony to the strategic importance of economic warfare and the devastating effectiveness of operations that remain largely invisible to both enemy forces and civilian populations until their cumulative impact becomes irreversible.